We are now in chapter 4, ministry in the second millennium. I divided, as I said, the historical development into two chapters. Chapter 3, the first millennium. Chapter 4, the second millennium. This is, of course, an arbitrary kind of division because there's really not a strict division between especially in the Middle Ages. We talk about the 10th century. The Middle Ages starts from the years around 600 or 500 all the way to about 1400s. That's really the Middle Ages. So when we talk about ministry in the second millennium, we are actually talking about what is generally referred to as the High Middle Ages, the best part of the Middle Ages, not the best, but the highest peak of the Middle Ages. That is the around the 12th, 13th century. So we're here talking about the ministry in the second millennium, but I would like to remind you once more that at the end of our chapter 3, when I spoke about the end or the kind of a summary of the first millennium, I made mention about the two things, that two dynamics that were taking place. And that one is the whole idea of the marriage between the empire and the church. Okay, the marriage between the empire and the church was helpful, especially in the case of the invasion from the north, the tribal invasion from the north, because somehow the Roman Empire had to sort of resurrect, to come back to life or become more powerful again, to regain its power. And that it came, of course, in the 600s when talk about Charlemagne with the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, but that also spelled the idea that whether you are in the church or whether you're in the empire, there's a lot of power that you hold. And so eventually what happens, of course, is that the leaders of both the empire and the church will be so powerful that everybody else who does not have that kind of power are under them, below them. And when you talk about the Middle Ages, the feudalistic structure of the Middle Ages lent itself very, very well to this kind of mentality. So the sacerdos, as we say, the sacerdos and the empire, they were joining together. But in moments when they disagreed with one another, so for example, an emperor would contradict a pope or a church leader, and they would say, well, the church leader could easily say, aha, I am a religious, I have an authority from God. You do not have an authority from God. So in a way, the church leader is saying, I am superior to you. You follow what I have to say because I can condemn you, I can excommunicate you, etc. On the other hand, when the empire becomes powerful over the church, then either it uses the church according to its own desires, but also at the same time, it is able to dictate on the church what it wants to do. As for example, in the appointment of bishops, the appointment of, and even in the selection of the popes, the emperors were very, very powerful. They had a voice. They had a voice that you cannot just ignore. Even if you are the highest of the church leader, you cannot just ignore this. On the one hand, that is the case, the dynamic between the empire and the church. But there's also the other dynamic, but within the church, the dynamic of the priests, sacerdos, in other words, the leaders, the bishops, the popes, and on the other side, the lay people. Majority of the Christians, of course, at this time were lay people. But the leaders were on top of the pyramid, the feudal pyramid. They were on top. So they were the ones who held power. And especially if those spiritual leaders also had material power because they owned properties. So those servants or those people who were the tenants in those what we would now call papal states had to pay tribute or pay taxes to the Pope. So eventually the Pope became not just a spiritual power, but also imperial power or a secular power, which is something that was very, very difficult to extricate from each other. It only happened in the First Vatican Council. All right. Okay, so that is the kind of background that we're talking here. But now we're starting the second millennium, and what do we find really in the second millennium? Well, a lot of things. The age of scholasticism, 1055 to 1414. That is the age bracket that Paul Bernier has used. So ministry as hierarchy. So you can already pretty much get an idea that the ministry that we are talking here would be focusing on the ordained ministry, not ministry of the lay people. Because now ministry has become reduced as the province of the people who wield power in the church. So ministry as hierarchy. But there's another group in the church during these Middle Ages that were also powerful. So when we talk about ministry, we talk about priesthood at the onset of the second millennium. You notice again, or you remember that this whole idea of cultic priesthood as primarily cultic, is something that got started in the time of the fathers of the church, most especially in Hippolytus, when you start talking about the priest as, well, very much like the priest of the Old Testament. It's now priesthood now is a kind of a state of life, a state of life. So those who are called to lead, to be leaders in the church are called to a special state of life, a distinctive state of life, in distinction to the state of life of the majority who are lay people. So priesthood at this time was seen largely in terms of sacramental ministry. What we mean by sacramental ministry, where what you do, well, what you do in at Mass. That is basically what you do. So when you look at priesthood from the point of view of sacramental ministry, in other words, from a cultic perspective, then in a way you can be talking about a limitation of ministry. Ministry is now something that is just cultic. All the other things may not be considered as ministry, or if they are at all considered ministry, then they are not, if they are not done by the priests or by the bishops, then they are not as important ministry in the church. Not as important as the cultic ministry. In the cultic ministry, in the sense of cultic ministry, we see that the primary responsibility is the consecration of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. Consecrare enim est principalis actus, ad quem sunt actus omnium ordinum, according to Albert the Great. The principal act is, however, for the principal act is to consecrate, that is to consecrate, to change the body and blood, the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, to which all other actions are directed, are ordered. Okay, this is a free translation. In other words, that is the focus of ministry. That is the focus. What you do when you say, "This is my body, this is my blood," that is the focus of ministry. All other functions flow from the power of jurisdiction, meaning you only have power if the bishop tells you that you have a power or delegates you with the power. For example, confirmation, you can do that. For example, administration. For example, visiting the sick, you can do that if the parish priest or if the bishop tells you, you do this, then you have a delegated power, which is basically from the point of view of jurisdiction. The one who has that power by ordination is the bishop or the priest. Okay. If you are not given the power of jurisdiction, therefore you cannot exercise your power as a priest in the the territory of the bishop or the parish priest. Okay, historical background in the 10th century. You find there in a beautiful picture of the Gothic cathedral. Now, this is very emblematic of the Middle Ages. Gothic cathedrals are the probably crowning glory of the High Middle Ages. It's beautiful. Do you know why the Gothic cathedral is shaped like this? They're all pillars going up, 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 because the Gothic cathedral is meant for you to go look from below all the way up. You go up. And who is up there? There is God. And who is there near God? The Pope, the bishops, the priests up there. That's why the pillars will lead your sight, your senses to go up and look towards heaven. So this period was a time of renaissance. For example, in theology and in philosophy, you have some great theologians and philosophers during this period. But what brought about the Renaissance, especially in the Middle Ages, was not only some of the previous works of people like Boethius and Peter Lombard, but also the arrival of Aristotle into the Middle Ages, facilitated by Muslim philosophers Averroes and Avicenna. And they were the ones who introduced Aristotle to the Middle Ages. And from there, of course, Thomas Aquinas and company took off. They used the philosophy of Aristotle as the basis for their theology, whereas previously they used, following Augustine, they used the Neoplatonic perspective, Neoplatonic philosophy to build the theology that we now speak of as the Augustinian theology, or basically the Neoplatonic version of the theology in the church. Now, as we all know, Plato and Aristotle are two different perspectives of looking at reality. But at this time, now, at the beginning, of course, of the what we call the Scholastic period, the Franciscans, who were the dominant teachers or theologians, were still basing their theology on Augustine. When Aquinas came, and of course some of the Dominicans, when they started to teach and become the preachers, they started to make use of Aristotle, and eventually, of course, in the scholastic colleges and schools and universities, what prevailed was the Aristotelian perspective of theology. So the flowering of theology and philosophy, as well as natural sciences and art. Again, example of the Gothic cathedral. The Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris is the one which was recently burnt, is a typical example of the High Middle Ages Gothic cathedral. There's a very beautiful Gothic cathedral, of course, in Cologne, in Germany, but this is more the Neo-Gothic cathedral, much later, maybe 17th, 18th century already. But the another older cathedral than the Notre Dame is the one in where is this place? Reims, in also in France, an old cathedral where the kings, the French kings used to be what do you call this? Consecrated as kings, as French kings. So they became the symbols of medieval Renaissance, or the Renaissance of the Middle Ages. Theology. You will remember that we were talking about monasticism, the schools that were started in the monasteries. Many of the population at the beginning of the Middle Ages, were ignorant, were illiterate. And it was the monasteries that provided them with the proper education and intellectual training. Eventually, the monasteries, of course, developed into schools. So we would have the monastic schools, and the teachers, of course, are the monks. And the monks, you would ask, why would the monks become teachers? Precisely because they were also the ones, not only were educated, but they were also the ones copying the books from ancient times handwritten, copying all these books, and so they were becoming more and more familiar with what was written. So they had a kind of a knowledge on what has been the previous philosophy, let's say in the time of the fathers of the church. So they were the logical people who would be considered as the teachers, the early teachers. Eventually, the monastic schools became what we now call the colleges. In Europe, when you talk about the college, it is normally referred to as a residence for people who are going to study, but they could be studying in a different place, in a different institute. But that's why when you talk about a college in Europe, especially in medieval Europe, you're talking about a place where they reside, which is basically the monastic schools. But then they could be going to the University of Paris or another university for the academic part. It's like the Paul House and SVST in a way. You live in the Paul House, but you go to SVST. Okay. Eventually, of course, these colleges became the universities. University of Paris grew out of the monastic schools and eventually, of course, the colleges. So the they were mostly in big cities. These are schools and colleges. Where there are monks, there will be colleges and there will be schools. Okay. Where there are no monks, then that's a problem. Where there are no monastic monasteries, then you would have problems. You probably, if you have a family and you have children, you would like them to be educated, you would have to send them to the monastic schools. Okay. Now, in terms of popular piety, there was this piety again, a very medieval kind of spirituality. It was almost always what is directed towards God, and it became more and more individualistic and private. Private means, well, I can go to my corner and pray what I need to pray. Then I'm doing my job. What happened, of course, is that the idea of a communal celebration is slowly forgotten, because now I can take care of my spiritual needs just by reciting my prayers or reciting some psalms or some prayers. And this is the beginning of what we would call the devotions, personal, private devotions. Okay. But that is one. But the other thing is that the world of the scholars, the world of those who are intelligent, who are the intellectuals, they're different. They're different. They are in the world of the academe, so to speak. And the piety, some of them are priests or are members of the clergy, and so they have their own perhaps their own affiliation with a monastery or something. So they have their own practices, they have their own spiritual exercises, so to speak. Whereas the people were just left practically to themselves. Okay, but at this time the theologians had sort of regained their prestige and position in the church, because they even could make some commentaries on church pronouncements, church pronouncements of bishops. You will remember that during the time of the fathers of the church, many of the bishops who were the great leaders, the great fathers of the church, the doctors of the church, were also intelligent people, intellectual people, theologians and philosophers in their own right. So you have the bishop who was also a theologian or a philosopher. Now, when we talk about the Middle Ages, we're not talking about some people who are bishops. Maybe they are career bishops, or maybe they are inherited bishopric. So they have become bishops by reason of their family connections, etc. Who are not necessarily theologians or the intellectuals. So because of the development of the schools, the colleges, and the universities, there's a group now who are called the lecturers, the people who would read. By the way, the word lecturer is very different. The word lecturer in our ordinary sense is the one who gives a talk. But actually, if you go back to the original meaning of lecturer, it goes to the word lectio, which is to read. That's why in Britain, when you go to a college, you go to a university, you say, what is the course that you are taking? You don't say, what is the course you're taking? You say, what do you read in the college? What do you read in the college? I am reading philosophy. I'm reading history. I'm reading theology. This is what it means. I'm taking theology, but I am reading. I am reading history. I'm reading. That is the meaning of lecturer. Okay. So theologians during the Middle Ages regained their prestige, and that is why you have people like Thomas Aquinas, who wasn't a bishop, Bonaventure, who wasn't a bishop, and all the other great. Albert the Great was a great teacher. Anselm of Canterbury was, well, I think, a bishop. But they were not. So the two positions were not actually what they call is put together in persons. More than likely, theologians decided to just speak of themselves as having a different kind of vocation. That is the vocation to be able to explore the meaning of what we are teaching, the dogmas and the articles of our faith. So, but as you can see, if the theologians are able to question, for example, some of the pronouncement of the bishops, then you can understand why some of the bishops would be wary about theologians. Okay, sounds familiar? Sounds familiar? Nowadays, some of the bishops are wary about theologians. Okay, they're wary about a group of theologians who are calling themselves Dakateo, because they said, "Oh, they're trying to teach us, and they're trying to teach us if they have the teaching authority in the church." Okay. So, what some of the theologians nowadays, especially lay theologians, they are just simply claiming what used to be the position of the theologian in the Middle Ages. They have a voice, they have a say on how to interpret the doctrines of the church. It doesn't mean that just because you are a bishop that you are capable of interpreting theologically the meaning of what we believe in. And many of the bishops relied on theologians to solve some issues, some problems. Okay, but not just theologians, however. There were also others who were called the Canon Lawyers. Okay, so the church was organized and eventually centralized. Outstanding bishops, we have popes, we have schoolmen, the theologians. We also had canon lawyers. And the canon lawyers were, of course, a little bit more, they go all the way back to the time of the Roman Empire, of course. Rome was basically famous for law. If you talk about law, the best place to study law would probably be Rome, because they have the Roman law has been there for a good more than 2,000 years. So they have the great tradition of lawyers. But law is different from theology, as you already know. Those of you who have taken a canon law already, law is different from theology. Law is application of a theological understanding. Okay, law is trying to put into practical terms, practical order or organization, what is a theological understanding. So canon law depends on theology for its proper, what we would call the proper grounding. Without the proper theology, then you would not be able to articulate really the law. Or if you have a different theological understanding, then we can expect that your interpretation in terms of law, especially canon law, would be different from other people who would have a different theological, what do you call, background. Okay, so not all law are the same, or not all lawyers interpret canon law in the same way, depending on the theological background. Okay. The Middle Ages was also famous for being the time when the Crusades were started. At this time already, well, not 800s, 700s, 800s, of course, Muhammad and Islam started to spread all throughout the Middle East, all throughout what was previously known as the Roman Empire, the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And it's now the Muslims that are in power. And so the Christian kings wanted to recover what we call the holy places, the places in the Holy Land. They wanted to reclaim that from the Muslims, because the Muslims have already overtaken them. They wanted to reclaim, and so they organized crusades. But that is not all. That's not all the reasons why they organized crusade. There was also something else, and it almost always had to do with both money and power. Money and power. Again, spreading the Holy Roman Empire to the different places. So, who would be the sponsors of the benefactors of the Crusades? Of course, the Christian kings, with the acquiescence of the popes, the medieval popes. And so, if the popes and the emperors come together, who can defeat them? But some of the crusades, of course, were not successful. They were not successful because the enemy was much, much stronger than them. They were able to recover some, but not everything. The downside is, wow, look and behold, sister, you see, the downside, church corruption and scandal. Nothing new, nothing new. It was widespread. Of course, the more power you have, the more scandal, the more corruption. Okay, that's almost like a formula that is absolutely proven from one generation to the next. The more power you have, the more corruption, the more scandal. So the more power you have in the country, for example, like the Philippines, you think corruption is not there, you think scandal is not there, wait till the person gets off power and you will find out what is really corruption. And so that is why the people who are in power now are trying to make sure that their successors are people who would be sympathetic to them and who would not bring them to court, okay, for the corruption that existed or that was perpetrated during their own presidency. Okay, so church corruption, well, nothing new. Church corruption and scandal widespread. Now, the general population, of course, they knew the peccadillos and the little, what do you call this, infidelities of the popes. And by the way, again, we talk about the popes, the bishops, and the priests having wives. At this point, that is still something that is quite common, because the idea of celibacy was not going to be imposed until much later, several centuries later. So very easily, then when you have something like that, well, okay. Now, so the population was aware, of course, of some of those things, but those who are knowledgeable would know that there is really corruption on the highest level. A lot of corruption on the highest level. But it's mostly only those who are also on the higher level of secular power, the emperors and the kings and the nobles, who would know something about the corruption in the higher echelon of the church. Okay. Now, greater and more centralized organization, of course, meant that there would be a greater influence of Rome in church affairs. I don't know if you realize that during the patristic period, when we talk about the empire divided into the east and the west, so there was a kind of a division of power. But slowly and slowly, Rome became more and more powerful. Especially if you are the Pope, you can be an instrument for reform, like Gregory the First or Leo the First, but you could also be an instrument for the destruction. Okay. Unmute. Who is DPH formators?
Julius.
It's me, I know.
Julius, Father.
Julius, okay, unmute. All right. Greater influence of Rome in church affairs. So we're talking here about influence of Rome as the seat of the Roman Empire. Okay. So for all problems, for all conflicts, you go to Rome to solve the conflicts and the issues. To solve these issues and these problems, what was done was to convoke councils. And the councils were mostly disciplinary in the sense of to say, this is wrong, this is to be permitted, etc., etc. And some of those councils, of course, were what we would call ecumenical councils. In other words, councils for the entire church, universal church. But also, it meant that feudal society would see hierarchy and order, the way it is structured now, as part of God's plan. That is why people in the hierarchy, even now, will always speak about hierarchy as something that is part of God's plan. God, Jesus Christ, had what he calls apostles, and then apostles and disciples, etc., etc. You go down the line, you go down the pyramid, and that is what you have hierarchy. So, how else can we justify this hierarchy than by saying it must be the plan of God, because that's how it developed. Okay, but again to remind us about the early Christian community where hierarchy was there, but it was not in the same way as we would now find hierarchy in the Middle Ages here. Now, what made hierarchy in the Middle Ages, especially hierarchy in the church in the Middle Ages, more powerful than, let's say, the hierarchy that existed with the apostles of the early Christian community was precisely because that hierarchy in the Middle Ages also had temporal power. Ahaha, ahaha. Temporal power was joined to the ecclesial power, which means it was almost hard to distinguish between a pope exercising his civil power as well as his spiritual power. It's the same person, same person. So who are those lay people who would question your power? You are the pope. You are the bishop. You have been ordained, okay? Ministry, or you have been ordained. So therefore, you have the absolute power. It must be part of God's plan. That's how they would justify it. The theologians in the 13th century, they were intellectuals at their own time. Thomas Aquinas, you would see. They influenced greatly theology and philosophy and canon law. But as you can see, many of the things that they were doing, like Thomas Aquinas, were actually commentaries on previous works or expansion on some of the works that were done by, let's say, Peter Lombard and Peter Abelard, all of this previous in the people in the early Middle Ages, and they are now codified into something that is much more systematic, much more what do you call this? Yeah, very orderly. Like the Thomas Aquinas would talk about certain questions, and then he would draw sources from the Bible, from other authorities to prove his own point, and then he would argue and develop his own theological understanding of why this is so and so, why we have to believe this as the doctrine of the church. That's a very extensive work. Like the Summa Theologica is a very extensive work. It's a great masterpiece, actually, in what do you call this? In writing, philosophical and theological writing. Okay. Now, the monastic schools were not just teachers, but they were also the what do you call, the receptacle of the all of this accumulated wisdom that came from the fathers of the church and from great traditions of learned people in the past. So the theologians started out to be commentators on the source books, for example, on the work of Augustine, on the work of, let's say, Cyprian, on the work of Hippolytus, on the work of Origen or Tertullian. That is how they exercise their theology. So, So Thomas's Summa was used as text by the students. But as I said, this was really a kind of an elaborated commentary and expansion of the of Peter Lombard's Book of Sentences. In Lombard's Book of Sentences, you only have sentences, but these are what we would call theses now. A thesis, a kind of a thesis statement. That is what the Book of Sentences basically was, a series of thesis statements. And then what Thomas did would be take one thesis and then develop it, explore it, and interpret it from different perspectives. Priests. The priests were, as we already said, found out, the priests were cultic figures. But aside from their responsibility as cultic figures, in other words, people celebrating the Eucharist or doing the consecration of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, aside from that, they were given another responsibility, and that is the forgiving of sins. And this developed also the whole tradition you would find in the sacrament of reconciliation and penance, developed also because of the tradition of what we call the monks, the monastic schools. Okay. In the early Middle Ages, in the flowering of monasticism, the monks were the spiritual guides of people. So when people had problems, they would go to the monks and ask for spiritual direction, basically. Eventually, of course, the spiritual direction would, maybe the monk who was also not an ordained priest, or some of them perhaps were ordained, then they would give kind of an advice and maybe give a kind of a blessing. Okay. Eventually, this thing developed into what we would call the private confession. And then that responsibility of hearing the confession and giving the absolution was given over not to the monks, but to the priests, those who are now ordained to celebrate the Eucharist as well as to forgive sins. So, in the patristic times, forgiving of sins, especially for public sinners, can be done only by the bishop. If the priest is delegated by the bishop, yeah, no, he can do that. But public sinners are forgiven by the bishop. Now, so what happened here, of course, is that not only do you have the privatization of the Eucharist, that we say now, the private Mass, we also have the privatization of confession. Instead of having a public penance where everybody is, you have what we call a penitential service. Everybody's involved. Everybody knows what is the problem, what are the sins that are being confessed, and what is the punishment or what is the penance that is being imposed by the bishop. Here we now talk about something else, very private. Okay, now you say 3 Our Fathers, 3 Hail Marys, and that is your penance. You see how much reduced the idea of confession is. It has become private. It has weakened its connection with the community. So it's now a matter of the penitent and the priest. Where's the community? Well, we always say the priest represents the community. Well, that's true. But again, the previous experience of the sacrament of reconciliation was that it is with the community that we are able to be forgiven of our sins. This is what we're trying to revive after the Second Vatican Council, the whole idea of penitential service as a communal exercise. Okay. Those of you